Imagine walking thousands of kilometers in the dead of the night, hands trembling as you walk through bushes in the blistering winter cold. You move with great speed, hoping that the next town will not be where you are caught and killed. You move on, hoping to reach the freedom that lies ahead. This is only a glimpse of what thousands of our people experienced. Despite this, we still had ingenious strategies for escape, and even developed an elaborate network that comprised free African Americans, as well as white abolitionists, offering shelter and aid to enslaved people escaping from the South. This became the Underground Railroad, which was developed as a convergence of several different clandestine efforts. Several key figures played very important roles in this operation, one of which is a fearless woman. She served as the conductor of this train for more than 8 years and helped hundreds of slaves move from the southern states, where slavery was still legal to the north, to become free people. Her name is Harriet Tubman. This documentary discusses the life, mission, and sacrifices of Harriet Tubman, one of America's renowned abolitionists and the famous conductor of the Underground Railroad.
Escaping slavery, risking everything to save her family, leading a military raid, championing the cause of women's suffrage. These are just a handful of the accomplishments of one of America's most courageous heroes.
Harriet Ross Tubman was many things in her long life. She used the force of her convictions to save lives and fight against oppression.
Harriet Tubman was born in March 1822 in Dorchester County, Maryland. Her parents, Harriet Green and Benjamin Ross, named her Araminta Ross and called her Minty. Harriet Green was a slave to Mary Pattison Brodess and later became a slave to Pattison's son, Edward. Benjamin, on the other hand, was a slave to Anthony Thompson. Thompson ran a large plantation very close to the Blackwater River in the Madison area in Maryland. He later got married to Mary, after which they had Araminta Ross and other kids. Harriet's maternal grandmother was among those brought into the U.S. on a slave ship from Africa. While growing up, Harriet was told she looked and acted like an Ashanti person. Her mother was a cook for the Brodess family, and her brother, Ben, was a skilled woodsman who managed the timber work on Thompson's plantation. Her parents got married in 1808, and based on court records, they both had 9 children together, and Harriet, fondly called Minty, was the 5th child. Her mother struggled to keep the family together as slavery tried to tear it apart. One time, she hid her youngest son for a month after a trader from Georgia had approached Brodess about buying him. 3 of Harriet's sisters were all sold into slavery at a very young age. Harriet's mother was a fierce and courageous woman. One time, when her slave master, Edward Brodess, and the trader from Georgia approached the slave quarters where she stayed with her family to finally take her son, she is famously noted to have said, "You are after my son, but the first man that comes into my house, I will split his head open." This statement made Brodess tremble, and he finally abandoned the sale. This was one of the many incidents in Harriet Tubman's early life that made her believe in the possibility of resistance to oppression and slavery. This also enforced the convictions that made her the woman she finally became. Harriet, like every other slave child during her time, didn't have the most impressive childhood. She was from a large family, and her mom was assigned to directly take care of the affairs of the main house of the slave masters. She hardly had time for her own family. Harriet took care of a younger brother and a baby while still a young child herself. When she was just 5 years old, Brodess hired her out to work as a nursemaid for one Miss Susan. Harriet was asked to take care of the baby and always cradle the baby until it fell asleep. Whenever the baby woke up and cried, Harriet would get a severe whipping. One particular morning, she was flogged more than 5 times before breakfast. She carried the scars from that flogging for the rest of her life. While working there, she later devised ways to resist. Sometimes, she ran away and hid for more than 5 days. Other times, she wore layers of cloth to protect her from the beatings, and in some other rare cases, she fought back whenever they tried to whip her. Harriet later worked at the home of a planter named James Cook. Working there was a miserable experience for her. She was in charge of checking the muskrat traps in nearby marshes. She kept at it even after she had contracted measles and became so ill that her master had to send her back to Brodess, where her mother nursed her back to health. But as soon as she showed signs of recovery, Brodess hired her out again. She was constantly away from home, and recalled how she was always longing for home. As she grew up stronger and older, she was assigned to field and forest work. She drove oxen and was also involved in plowing and hauling logs. One time, while working in the field, Harriet was involved in a severe head injury after an overseer threw a 2-pound metal weight at another slave who was attempting to flee. The weight struck Harriet on the head and broke her skull. She fell down unconscious and bled for a long time. She was eventually returned to her master's house, where she lay on the loom unattended and without any medical care for 2 days. This led to many cases of painful headaches. She also started having seizures and would sometimes fall unconscious. Although she claimed to be aware of her surroundings while appearing to be asleep, this injury also led to several periods when she had visions and vivid dreams, which she interpreted as revelations from God. These experiences became very spiritual for Harriet Tubman and had a profound impact on her personality and led her to develop a passionate faith in God. She couldn't read or write, but listened to a lot of Bible stories from her mother. She also attended the Methodist church with her family. While in church and during sermons, she rejected teachings from white preachers who constantly urged and asked slaves to always be passive and obedient to their masters. She also detested white preachers who also supported slave masters and asked the slaves to not protest against being trafficked, enslaved, and made to work in inhumane conditions. She found solace in the teachings of the Old Testament on deliverance, and the teachings greatly informed her actions throughout her life. Around 1844, Harriet got married to a free black man named John Tubman. The marriage was really complicated, as at the time, Harriet was still a slave woman. Although her father got a manumission after turning 45, her mother was denied manumission by the Pattison and Brodus family after they inherited her as a slave. Tubman couldn't challenge this. Although her new husband was a free man, she was still a slave, and the children took the status of their mothers, and as such, will be slaves as well. It was not uncommon for free African Americans to be married to slaves in the eastern shore of Maryland, where half of the African American population in that area were all free. Some families had free and enslaved members. Right after marrying John Tubman, she changed her name from Araminta to Harriet, adopting her mother's name to show her religious conversion and also a reverence for her mother. Although she was a slave, John planned to buy her freedom, but when that wasn't happening soon, she took a more drastic means. In 1849, she became ill again. This time, she was already old and so was not of much value to the slave traders. Edward Brodus had tried to sell her, but he couldn't find any buyer. At this time, Harriet started to get angry at Edward. She was angry that he was trying to sell her while still enslaving her relatives. She started praying for his repentance, asking God to turn him from his ways. For a long time, she spent her nights praying for him, but despite how long and fervent she prayed, her master was still bringing slave traders to come to check her out as he still tried to sell her off. After some time, her prayer changed, and she asked God to kill him if he was never going to change him. She prayed that God would take him out of the way. After a week, Edward Brodus died, and Harriet felt a deep regret for her earlier sentiments. After Edward Brodus's death, it was clear that she and her relatives will be sold out and the family broken. Harriet refused to wait until the time when she would be sold, despite her husband's plea to make her stay. She made up her mind to escape. There was one of two things I had the right to, she explained later: liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other. On September 17, 1849, Harriet and her brothers, Ben and Henry, escaped from slavery. Their absence was not noticed after so many days. However, 2 weeks later, Eliza Brodus reported their disappearance and offered a reward of up to $100 each for their capture and return to slavery. Harriet's escape wasn't successful. Halfway through the journey, her brothers had second thoughts and decided to return. The two men went back, forcing Harriet to come with them. But it didn't take long before Harriet decided to escape again. And this time, she didn't inform her brothers and did so alone. Before leaving, she spent some days singing a farewell song while she worked. Through the song, she revealed her intention, hoping that her friend and a trusted fellow slave, Mary, would understand. The soulful music announced her hope as she is bound for the Promised Land, although there is no record of that exact route she took. It is said that Harriet Tubman may have used the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad is an informal route of escape that was managed by both free and enslaved black people, white abolitionists, and other activists. The primary group of activists in this region included the members of the Religious Society of Friends, often referred to as the Quakers. Harriet's escape was possible through the help of this group. she must have stopped in the Preston area near Poplar Neck, where there was a substantial Quaker community, and from there, she probably took a common route used by people fleeing slavery. She moved through the Choptank River, crossing past Delaware, and then took the agonizing 90 miles journey of moving north into Pennsylvania by foot. It is estimated that Harriet must have spent about 3 weeks on this journey. She had to travel by night to avoid being spotted by those who caught fugitive slaves for rewards. She was guided by the North Star. The conductors in the Underground Railroad used tricks and deceptions for protection. When they had an early stop, the lady of the house instructed Harriet to sweep the yard so that it seemed as though she was working for the family. But as soon as night fell, the family hid her in a cart and took her to the next friendly house. Harriet was also very familiar with the bushes and marshes of the region, and during the day, she hid in the houses of different locales. After some days, she crossed into Pennsylvania with a feeling of relief and awe. She recounted how the experience changed her life and how she began to see life in a different way. She said that she saw everything differently. The sun came like gold through the trees, and she felt she was in heaven while moving through the fields. Harriet was excited about her freedom, and as soon after she crossed into Philadelphia, she began planning how she could also free her family members who were still in Maryland. She began working odd jobs and saved some money. It was during this time that the US Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. This law punished anyone found abetting escape and helping escape slaves. The law also forced law enforcement officials, even in states that had already outlawed slavery, to assist in their capture. This law made it very difficult for Harriet to move around easily, even in Pennsylvania. As a result of this, many of the slaves sought refuge in southern Ontario, which at the time was part of the British Empire that had abolished slavery. Also, at that time, there was a growing tension in Philadelphia between poor Irish immigrants who competed with free blacks for work. However, despite the fugitive slave law, despite the growing crisis in Philadelphia and other states, Harriet was ready to still help her relatives to escape. In December 1850, Harriet Tubman got the news that her niece Keziah and her 2 little children, 6-year-old James Alfred and baby Araminta, were about to be sold into slavery. She was told that they would soon be sold in Cambridge. This news got her worried, and she quickly moved to Baltimore, where her brother-in-law, Tom Tubman, hid her until the sale. Keziah's husband, a free black man named John Bally, attended the auction of his wife and was able to make the winning bid for her. And as soon as the auctioneer stepped away to have lunch, John, Keziah, and their children escaped to a nearby safe house. When night fell, Bowley sailed the family on a long canoe 60 miles to Baltimore. Over there, they met with Tubman, and she brought the family to Philadelphia. After successfully helping her niece and her children, she returned to Maryland to help her other family members over there also escape. She successfully took her brother Moses and 2 other unidentified men. After some time, she started working with abolitionist Thomas Garrett, who was a Quaker working in Wilmington, Delaware. She became a mastermind in helping many people escape from Maryland, and after some time, she became popular and grew a reputation among other slaves. With each trip to Maryland, she became more confident. 1 year later, Harriet returned to Dorchester County for the first time since her escape. She went back to find her husband, John. She worked several jobs and saved up money for the journey. She bought a suit for him and later made her way south. In all, Harriet was optimistic that she would meet her husband and take him back to Philadelphia. But unfortunately, John Tubman had gotten married to another woman named Caroline. Some years after Harriet left, Harriet sent words to him asking him to come and join her, but John insisted that he was happy where he was. This got Harriet very angry, and she planned on storming John's house and creating a scene. But after some time, she decided he was not worth the trouble. She didn't want to waste the trip, so after suppressing her anger, she found some slaves who were eager to escape and helped them to escape to Philadelphia. John and Caroline raised a family together until he was killed 16 years later in a roadside argument with a white man named Robert Vincent. Harriet became more active and helped many other slaves gain their freedom. In December of 1851, she assisted and guided a group of 11 fugitives to the north. She also met with Frederick Douglass, another famous freedom fighter who helped in housing some of the slave fugitives until there was enough money to take them up to Canada. Harriet and Douglass had great admiration for each other. Harriet continued her expedition to Maryland for more than 11 years. She helped rescue about 70 slaves in 13 expeditions, which she carried out in the region. She was finally able to rescue her brothers, Henry, Ben, and Robert, together with their wives and children. Apart from the slaves she helped escape directly, Harriet Tubman also helped about 50 to 60 others with useful guides and information that helped them escape to the north. As her fame increased, she became known as Moses. This was because she had some similarities to the biblical Moses in the book of Exodus and how he led the Hebrews out of Egypt. In this case, Harriet was helping the African Americans in slavery out of Maryland to the north where they could enjoy freedom. After some years, she made plans to return to Maryland for the last time to retrieve her parents. While both of her parents were now free, it was still necessary that she rescued them as the area was now becoming hostile to their presence. There was a delay in her plans, but when she got the news that her father was at risk of arrest for harboring a group of 8 people escaping slavery, Harriet hastened up her preparation. She traveled to the eastern shore in Maryland and was able to help her parents escape to the north to St. Catharines, Ontario. There, they were welcomed by a community of other slaves, which included Harriet's brothers, friends, and relatives. Harriet performed her work with a religious attitude, working tirelessly to free as many slaves as she could. She worked more during the winters, believing that during this period, the nights were long and dark, which reduces the likelihood of the slaves being caught. She was also a genius at strategizing escape plans. As soon as she established contact with the slaves seeking to escape, she would escape with them, usually on a Saturday evening. Harriet had observed and figured that escapes on weekends had a higher success rate since newspapers would not print runaway notices until Monday morning. Indeed, the job was as dangerous as walking barehanded into a lion's den. But Harriet was very clever, and she used various methods to avoid being caught. One time, she disguised herself with a bonnet and carried 2 live chickens so that it seemed as though she was running errands. When it seemed she was approaching the house of a former slave owner, she caused a commotion by yanking the legs of the birds and using the agitation made by the chicken to avoid eye contact with anyone that might recognize her. Her commitment to freeing slaves was also hugely influenced by her religious faith, as on many occasions, she spoke about consulting with God before any expedition. She was very confident that He would keep her safe. In addition to that, she was also able to sense when there would be a danger on the way, allowing her to enjoy a huge success in helping fugitives move across the border. Interestingly, even though Harriet believed in God's protection, she also carried a revolver and was never afraid to use it. With this gun, she was able to protect herself and the fugitives from slave catchers and their dogs. But the same gun also helped her to maintain orderliness among fugitives, as she often threatened to shoot anyone who halfway through the journey became scared and wanted to run back. Harriet thought that this was a necessary measure, as their return could threaten the entire safety of the remaining group and the entire operation. One time, she pointed the gun at the head of one fugitive who insisted on going back to the plantation and told him, "You go on or die." He remained with the group and gained his freedom after moving to Canada. As her stealth operation continued in Maryland, none of the slave traders thought that it was a woman in charge. They all assumed it was some northern white abolitionist who was secretly enticing away the people they had enslaved. Soon, there was a reward for her capture, but despite all of these, neither Harriet nor any of the fugitives she had helped escape were ever captured. She was the conductor of the Underground train for 8 years, and she told an audience one time that during this period, she never ran her train off the track, and neither did she lose any passengers.
I was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, and I can say what many others cannot. I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger.
In 1859, Harriet bought a piece of land from abolitionist Republican U.S. Senator William H. Stewart for $1,200. She later constructed a house which became a safe haven for her parents and relatives who were suffering from the harsh Canadian winters. For years, she took in relatives and boarders, offering a safe place for African Americans seeking a better life in the North. Harriet also played a huge role in the Civil War of 1861. She offered her skills and expertise to the Union, and later joined the Boston and Philadelphia abolitionists, heading to the Hilton Head district in South Carolina. She also served as a nurse in Port Royal, treating and preparing remedies for soldiers suffering from dysentery. She also rendered assistance to men with smallpox, and miraculously, she didn't contract any of the diseases herself. This led many to say that she was divine and blessed by God. Harriet was staunchly dedicated to her cause and lived simply, and when it seemed like the government rations she was getting for her work were causing sentiments among the newly freed blacks, she gave up her right to these supplies to ease the tension. She made enough money selling pies and root beer, which she prepared in the evenings. After President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, Harriet intensified her effort in liberating Black people from slavery. She provided intelligence and renewed her support for the defeat of the Confederacy. She worked alongside Colonel James Montgomery and provided him with key intelligence that aided in the capture of Jacksonville, Florida. That same year, Harriet Tubman became the first woman to lead an armed assault during the Civil War. Her various humanitarian work for the enslaved meant that she had no money, and despite her effort and years of service, she never received a regular salary. She also had difficulties obtaining a government pension. After many years of helping many enslaved African Americans gain freedom, Harriet returned to Auburn, where she spent her remaining years. She took in boarders to help pay the bills and took on odd jobs to take care of her aging parents. She met and fell in love with Nelson Charles Davis, a farmer born in North Carolina. Though he was 22 years younger than her, they both were in love and got married. They adopted a baby girl named Gertie and lived together as a family. Nelson later died of tuberculosis in 1888. After Nelson's death, Harriet still continued in her philanthropic activity and was active in the church, even donating a large portion of her estate to the church. As she aged, the seizures, headaches, and childhood trauma began to trouble her, and the pain persisted after numerous surgeries. By 1911, she became so frail and was admitted to a rest home, which was named in her honor. On March 19, 1913, surrounded by friends and family members, she died of pneumonia. Her last words to those around her before she died were, "I go to prepare a place for you." She was buried with semi-military honors at Fort Hill Cemetery.